Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm here today with Jin-Soo. He is a partner at the Learning Accelerator, manages the Parabola Project, and is also a columnist for EdSurge. So hi, Jin-Soo. It's so great to have you here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to having this conversation.
Likewise, you are doing so much work with the Parabola Project around maximizing learning and wellness, especially during this time with COVID-19. And I know you were working on similar things previously with schools, but can you share what that looks like now? I know you're looking at personalized pathways and interventions and whole child. So maybe we'll just start with the personalized pathways.
Yeah, so I'll kind of give just a broad overview of the Parabola Project and then dive into personalized pathways. So, the Parabola Project came together when, we realized we have education expertise, but clearly there's a public health crisis going on with the pandemic. And so we partnered with an organization called Ariadne Labs, which is a joint partnership between a joint center located between the Brigham and Women's Hospital and the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. So they were able to really bring their public health expertise, and we brought our education expertise. And we helped schools think through, we developed some tools for schools to help think through what it would mean to reopen and what it could look like. So we were endorsing reopening, but saying, here are the things that you should consider. And if you are going to reopen, like thinking about masks, distancing, and all of those things. And we started creating toolkits specifically around, how do you start creating a mask culture so kids, don't view it as an impediment, but like something that could be actually kind of fun, like, can you make it personalized? We saw one school in Boston had their art teacher actually had kids do self-portraits this year wearing masks. So it's like, small things like that to make it part of the culture and exciting. And then we also just heard from a bunch of schools that hadn't reopened, like what are these schools that have reopened? Like, what does it look like? So we started partnering with a lot of schools that did reopen, just to document, things like what does arrival and dismissal look like? What does lunch look like? Like what does teaching look like? Like I can't, sit next to a child like I normally do. So what does this all look like on there? As we're starting to do this work, we're also documenting, what does teaching like really look like? We know about simultaneous learning and how hard that is for teachers to teach both in-person students and also some kids remotely. And, how do you give them a really solid experience on there? Remote instruction is just really hard. We know that there's just a different pedagogy behind it. And most teachers were trained with in-person and that's all their experience has been. And so how, we've been like documenting how teachers have been adjusting to that. And, I think even more so than that, we're also starting to think through, what are some things that can stick next year? That, some things that teachers are trying out. One thing we know for certain is that, every single child has had a very different experience with remote learning or actually just learning in general this year. Just first off, some schools open hybrid, some schools never open. So the students are remote. On top of that, some students have a great home condition or they are, we've heard from some reports that introverts are just really thriving right now and like loving the, they are, appreciate the choice or like being able to kind of blaze through or, they're finding other opportunities, with online courses to really thrive. And then, unfortunately on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have students, who've never logged in. We don't know where they are at, or their internet's not great at home. So they're not doing great in this. So, how are we going to create personalized pathways for students so that when they come back, like we're able to honor not just their academic learnings and where they're at, but also, their mental health and social emotional learning where they're at. And I also hope that we're able to start seeing, a more infusion of like, where are people's interests? Like, where are people, where are their strengths, where are their areas of growth that we're able to kind of tailor more pathways for them when we get back. And even now, actually, we shouldn't even start next year. I mean, what are people doing now?
And are you working with schools that are working through this now and creating personalized pathways, either for distance learning or in-person learning?
Yeah, we've talked to some schools that have taken some steps. And I think that's one of the things that's exciting, but also really daunting. I think about rolling out, a tech initiative or a mastery-based learning plan, trying to get schools, communities to move in that direction. Normal times we're like, maybe like a 3-year rollout, we're going to work with the community, get investment, really build teacher capacity, and then like pilot it for a second and then like move on and like bring it out. And we kind of have to move faster at this point. So, I think about some schools that are finding some touch points that they're able to do this. I think about a school in Massachusetts, Uxbridge High School. They realize foreign language is actually a really nice place that they can use mastery-based learning, and the teachers really bought into it. And students are able to work on a pathway, do listening activities, work on the grammar, and then come back whole group, and do some like talking exercises or even in partners. So they were able to kind of find ways to kind of incorporate those kinds of things on there. And I also think that there's the schools that have thrived during this time were schools that had set up kids for success in this kind of setting in terms of, developing independent skills for students. So if you had taught kids how to set goals, reflect on your progress, reflect on your data, those schools, I'm not saying blanket, have done well, but like largely have found more success than others where, if you went to a school where the teacher was at the center, everything was directed through them, the students now don't have the teacher all the time. It's much harder. I think about Dallas Independent School District, and, they have a really, really robust personalized learning department, and they support a ton of schools going through these individual pathways. So it's not uncommon. Like you can walk into schools, pre-pandemic, of course, kids are working on choice boards, kids are, thinking about goals, they know their data. And so when they transitioned to remote learning for a bit, students were able to regulate, know what they were on, identify their interests, ask for help when needed. And that's been really cool to see that those foundational skills were able to translate to remote for a lot of students.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we found as well. So our school is really focused on personalized learning and building independence and student agency. And we found when we went to remote learning, it was challenging to do a specific English language arts lesson or a specific math lesson where a teacher is presenting material and then students are expected to work on it along with them. But in the project groups that we had in the afternoons, kids were engaged, kids were asking questions, kids were building their own parts and inventions to go along with their project. And so it's been really interesting as we look at this moment in time and education as a broader, in the broader term, when we look at what's really important and what skills do kids need to be successful in life, because right when we're working, once we move on, once we're in high school, once we're in college, once we have a job, there's not somebody sitting there telling you what to do and feeding you information all the time. And so how do we use this time and these lessons to help our schools move towards building those skills?
Absolutely. And I'm guessing there are many people who suddenly switch to remote work, having to work from home, who are also similarly struggling with, like there's not the peer accountability. Like I'm at home right now. Like how do and I know plenty of adults, myself included, who struggle with executive functioning skills at the time, like with setting goals, making sure I'm not procrastinating or other things like that. But yeah, it has been really interesting to see what are these skills that kids need that aren't just like, math and reading. What are these other skills that kids need to thrive, not just now, but in the future?
Yeah. So you also talked about an interventions approach as kids are coming back to school and the differences between kids' experiences, both academically and social emotionally, and just with their home life and their general experience with the pandemic and with what's happening. So how are schools creating a more personalized interventions approach that you see as we go back?
Yeah, I think that this is something that schools are really grappling with right now. And I will say, I feel for all school leaders, including yourself and others, like trying to figure out what is the right approach as they return next year. And because there's also so much to deal with right now in the moment as well. So you're already at capacity now and starting to think through next year. So I know these are some nascent plans and some ideas that have been thrown around and people are still thinking about. I think about, we're not working with them directly, but Cleveland had talked about, maybe we need to get rid of age-based grades. If people are coming in and with such range, and as a former teacher, like, I think we all remember, I taught 6th grade math and kids came in at all kinds of ranges and, before all of this, and, next year is even going to be more pronounced on there. So I think, there's a few different things that we've heard, even in the time of remote learning, we've seen some school districts start playing around with the role of the teacher. Like, does every teacher need to be doing the same thing? Like, does every teacher need to be lesson planning, grading, pulling small groups, what have you. We've heard of some districts who tried out, hey, this teacher's really good at online instruction. Like they should be the ones teaching like whole group. Like they need to be the one lecturing.
Mm-hmm.
Other teachers are going to be there afterwards to then start pulling kids out for small groups and providing intervention and doing that small group approach so that students are able to get that, small group attention that they need. Others are really good at lesson planning, and like they're the ones who should specialize on that. So I do think like there is an opportunity for us to start playing around with this and like the roles and what are certain teachers really good at, and how do we leverage that even better on there. I do wonder a lot about, like the interventions approach and schedule wise and other logistics on there. But I think like, one small thing that we've seen is lots of schools have had advisories before the pandemic, where they have small groups with an advisor where they're talking about social emotional learning skills, able to connect with peers in a safe space. You're also seeing a ton of districts as a result of the pandemic, designate one staff member for at least, a small group of students so that they're able to check in on them, make sure that, if they have any questions. And so I think you're going to start seeing like that approach also still translate next year as more and more schools go in person. Like at the very least, is there one adult in the building that every single student feels like they have a strong relationship with, whether it's like a formal one, like an advisor, or a check-in on here as well. I also think that, after we assess students quickly to see where everyone's at, which is also going to be no small lift. And so I'm not minimizing that on there as well. But I wonder, like, are we able to devote more time to small group interventions? Because there's going to be a lot of backfilling that kids are going to need on there as well. There's going to have to be, a lot of questioning of like, what are the key things that kids need to learn this year? How do we pull kids out for small group instructions so that kids are catching it up? I think there's also a role that technology can play here. Can students learn asynchronously, and then can teachers plug in if students are struggling and really, have a gap on there as well. So I think there's a lot of questions for next year. Not so many answers yet, but I'm heartened to see that people are starting to ask these questions and not just say, well, we have to just do it because that's the way we used to do it. The one thing that gives me pause is, everyone's life was upended this year, like last year and this year as a result of the pandemic. And I think a lot of people, from students to parents to teachers to principals and others, may long for quote unquote normalcy. And so what are the things next year? What are changes that can happen that are needed but won't rock the boat so much that others don't revolt against it? Or how do you start communicating this now to stakeholders so they can expect the changes? I think a low-hanging fruit is social emotional learning. I think everyone has realized it's not just a buzzword, it's actually really important, and that kids have this. But I also think about, there's some districts who are talking about maybe we should be moving to mastery-based learning, which I'm excited for and I'm a clear proponent of. But I also worry, do we have buy-in from others? Do we have capacity? Do we have support for folks as well? Or are people going to be like, I just want my normal A to F, rating system like we normally have? So also I think leaders are going to have to start thinking about what are the battles that they can fight next year and what are some areas that they can lay foundations for.
Yeah, it's a good point. As people want to return to normal, how do we keep some normal while still taking the lessons that we've learned from this and creating change?
Yeah.
And it's a real turning point. And one of the things that I've been most excited about is that everybody is asking these questions. 2 years ago, nobody was asking these questions. It was a battle to try and have a conversation about mastery learning or student-centered learning or building in a full social emotional curriculum. And now it's almost taken for granted that we need to move towards some of these things and looking at what is really important in school, because there are kids who have missed so much. So what are the things that they really need? What's the knowledge and what are the skills that they really do need? And how do we create those intervention groups to focus on those, so that those kids are getting the skills that they need?
Yeah, and one thing that does provide me some optimism is, I think about, I'm a former director of instructional technology, and a lot of my work often was, training teachers to use a new program or new hardware or what have you to implement there. And that was hard work, right? You always had those early adopter teachers who were doing all kinds of great work. You had those, who were like, let's just wait and see. But you had some people who were like, I'm fine with pencil and paper, done it for a long time, let's just stick with it. Unfortunately, the pandemic kind of forced, schools to roll out one-to-one devices in a very, very quick way. But one thing that's been kind of cool about it is, I never thought every single teacher now is familiar with Zoom or Google Meet. Everyone is familiar with that. Everyone is familiar to a large degree with learning management system. So many people are now familiar with Schoology or Google Classroom at a deep level. And I think about, walking into a traditional district, walking in virtually to a virtual PD and, hearing these traditional district school teachers who didn't have much technology beforehand, being like, oh, we can do that on Pear Deck. We could do that asynchronously. That has completely changed. And I think something that's going to be exciting is next year and from here on out, really, we can assume a base level of edtech proficiency that we couldn't before. And so I think that there's room to play, and it's been exciting to hear teachers say, oh, this is something that's going to carry, I'm going to use past the pandemic. This is something that's really cool. And I've been wondering about that. So I think that's going to be a new foundation, a huge jumpstart from previous years.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a way for teachers to also shift the way they're thinking about education and shift the way they're thinking about their classroom, because they are going to have such a wide range of students that when you can draw in those technology resources, now you can differentiate the groups a little bit easier and let kids, get some challenge in one area and more support from an educator in another as they work both independently, even within a classroom, and with their educator.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things of the Learning Accelerator, part of the mission of the Learning Accelerator, is to make the potential possible.
Yeah.
So what are some of those things, even before COVID or looking way past COVID, what are some of those potential things that you're working on making possible?
Yeah. And so I think, we're definitely still working on these things during COVID. I think we're, like we just talked about, there's an opportunity presented that that people are starting to think about these leaps that people can make and jump on there. I think mastery-based learning is definitely one of them. I think about, what does an A mean? What does a B actually mean for parents? And it's something so ingrained. We all grew up with it. Parents grew up with it. Teachers gave it to us. But we also know that, I joke about, oh, you got an A in Miss Smith's class. That's really hard to do. Oh, you got an A in Mr. Johnson's class. Everyone gets an A in that class, right? That doesn't mean anything on there. So how do we progress so that students are, also not just getting seat time, but it doesn't mean oh, you sat in a class, that means you must have mastered it on there. But we all know that's not the case. We also know that, plenty of students come in with knowledge ahead of time, but that's not honored. You still have to sit through the class in order to get the credit. So I think we've been pushing, what kind of changes can look there. You mentioned your school. I had a chance to look at your school and focus on personalized learning. And student agency is such a big thing. And I love that student agency is something, I think a lot of people go, oh, that's something for high schoolers. It's no, this is something that can start early. This is something that, kids know what they're interested in. They have preferences. How do you start helping them voice their opinions and who they are, and start questioning who they are as learners, and start developing their identity as learners, and what they're curious about, what interests them, what scares them, all those kinds of things. And so I think we've also been pushing in that direction a bit, to make sure that it's more student-led, and the teacher can serve more as a facilitator and helping them, learn as a partner alongside them. So that's another thing that we are really excited about. And we have seen really, really cool examples of students, whether small things like choice boards, here are 3 activities, choose one of them, or choose the order that you want to do it in. Really small on there. But, even things like, how do you show your learning? Does it have to be a standardized test? Or can it be a project? Or can you do a verbal assessment, an oral assessment? Are there other ways to show that you know something? Because we know that, plenty of students know things, and they may not be the best test takers, definitely know material and can show that on there as well.
Yeah, and the flip side of that is plenty of students learn things just for the test, and the day after it's gone. So
crammed it all in, and then as soon as you walk out, it's all right, what's next?
I know. I often think about if I actually knew all of the things that I had learned, it would be phenomenal.
Yeah, I cannot tell you, all the, how the parts of the body or, all those things anymore, but I did know them all at one point.
You can, yeah, you somewhere you've got a test that you got an A on that you
Yep.
labeled
Yep.
everything.
Yeah, I mean, I remember some dates in US history, but I couldn't tell you specific dates anymore.
No,
But
absolutely not. And are the dates important? Like Siri can tell you the dates if you really want to know. That's all instantly available information.
yeah, and I mean, I think that another thing that we're also looking at is like, what is the role of project-based learning and interdisciplinary learning as well? It's been cool to see some school districts recognizing that, a kid can't just sit in front of a computer for 7 hours, right? Like that's just not realistic. But can they start developing projects together, especially if there's multidisciplinary where teachers are able to jump in together, so that students are able to see, that learning doesn't happen in a math silo or a reading silo, like they're all interconnected on there, and students are able to explore and research. I think that's something that I've seen some teachers start implementing, and even they recognize, project-based learning is hard to plan. It's not easy to do, but when it's done really effectively, the engagement from students, the learning from students is just so much deeper. And I'm hoping that's something that can happen and progress, once we return to quote unquote normal.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's one of the things that we do a lot of, and that I talk to a lot of other educators and thought leaders and other students about. Whenever I ask, like, what was the most meaningful thing or what was the most successful class, a student always tells me about a project that they did. I talked to Bob Lenz a few weeks ago, and he talks about a poetry project that he did in 5th grade that literally stuck with him, took him into education, and that he started teaching when he was a teacher and has, led into PBL works and building project-based learning.
That's amazing. That's really,
yeah.
really cool.
But it's that stuff that's super impactful when students realize that they can draw their subjects together, they can create a thing, and they can share it with the world. That's really amazing. And that's where we're actually launching a project-based portal in hopefully about a month or so that'll give a whole project outline so teachers can create their own with a framework, or use one that we've created to try and help educators with creating and implementing projects.
So providing like a structure so that, it's like, hey, start with this and, plug in here so that they can start playing around with it a bit and not completely a wide open space for them.
Yeah, well, they'll have both pre-built projects with full lesson plans, like week by week, day by day lesson plans, or just a structure that they can create their own.
Very cool.
Yeah, because I agree with you. I really think that that's where learners learn the most. But that leads us, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's the sticky learning. Like, we remember those projects, those experiences, I can't tell you, this worksheet that I did was so cool. And like, I remember like learning from it. And, worksheets have their place on there, but the deep, deep learning that happens, is from a group project and learning interpersonal relationships, like hands-on learning, or like I did a ton of research and I made this connection and I presented about it. Like those are the things that really, stick.
Yeah, the only worksheets that I remember were my 7th grade geography teacher gave us extra credit for taking home and coloring in and labeling all of the countries on different worksheet pages that were different continents that had all the countries on them. Which I, of course, being an overachieving student, took home and colored in neatly and labeled all of my countries and got my extra credit.
Excellent. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I probably would have done the same if I was off.
But one of the things that I love to ask people, I run an elementary school, is, what is a memory that you have from your elementary years? And thinking back, it could be a story, it could be a teacher, it could be a project or a field trip. But what's one memory that stands out from elementary school?
Yeah. So I grew up in Southern California, and one of our big units was, every single year in social studies, we studied Native Americans. And I feel like every Californian can tell you about the mission project like that they had to do on there. But I also remember we went on a field trip where we went to an indigenous people like town and just like visiting that. They gave us like gum, which was like these leaves that were really chewy. Like I still remember that taste of the gum on there. But I just remember like realizing like, oh, like, I guess like as a 4th grader, I was kind of like, you have these like stereotypical images of like what the media has portrayed like Native Americans to be. And, it's always in the past, like, when you think about like cowboys and Indians, it's impactful to me to be like, these communities are still alive and like present and growing. Like these are not in the past on there. And I think like realizing like a lot of the learning still had an impact now, I think made a huge impact, and understanding like, this is why we need to learn like these things. Like it's like history is like still very much present on there. So I remember that really fondly. And I remember just like, they gave us food, like they had some like it was like a bread that was really good. I also eat a lot, so that's like, so food are sticking out at me on there. But I remember that that field trip very fondly.
Yeah, but that created that connection for you between history and present time, and why it's important to learn history and how that, you know, draws into what's happening currently, along with tasty flatbread.
Yes, exactly. That was always very good on there. And, you know, I think about, you know, the other things I remember a lot in elementary school are like, I did Odyssey of the Mind in second grade, and just like, that was just so different. You know, it wasn't like you come in and learn something. It was like, here's a challenge, figure it out. Like, you know, like here's a puzzle. And I just think that we don't do enough of that with students, these open-ended questions or solutions. Like there's not a right answer. And I remember as a teacher one time I gave to my sixth graders this really open question where I told them like, there's no right answer. I just want to hear how you think and like just see your thought process, and how much of a struggle that was for so many students. And I realized even for 11-year-olds, you know, we had ingrained in them, there is a right answer and a right process to do this. But how do we, you know, tap into the more creative thinking so that students can start playing around with those kinds of things. So I remember like those after school programs were really fun because it was such a different way of thinking about learning and stretching your mind in a different way.
That's cool to hear. We've run Odyssey of the Mind too. We ran a program last year.
Nice.
We're not doing it this year with the pandemic, but we may do it again in the future.
Yeah, I love it. I think it was, it's just, I mean, anyways, just like, you know, be creative and get those juices flowing. Just really cool, and just like taps into a very different set of like neurons, I'm guessing, or different parts of your brain.
Yeah, it's a different way of thinking.
Yeah.
That we're not, you're right, we get so ingrained in the right way and the wrong way, and sit and listen and learn and answer the questions, that to actually think through a question is really challenging for some people. My father-in-law tells a story. He used to teach a class. He's a PhD in education from UConn. And he would teach a class, and that was part of what he would do, is it would come in and there'd be an open-ended question. And so this is what we're going to explore this semester. There's not a written out syllabus. There's not a midterm and a final. Like, this is our exploration, and we'll see what you learn and what you explore. And every semester he'd have about half the students drop the class because they couldn't fathom like how to research and explore an open-ended question.
Yeah. Yeah, I even think about like math as like a former math teacher, like, you know, everyone wants the algorithm, right? Like, I feel like that was part of the pushback against the Common Core. And, you know, I love like the best math teachers are the ones who, you know, let kids explore, like all talk and discuss different solutions. It's like, oh, like you represented it in a different way. Can you share it with the class and like show like what you're thinking? And someone else show it a different way. And I think like being able to show people that like there's different ways of thinking about it that are all perfectly valid, you know, really pushes you. And, you know, it makes you start thinking, oh, like, I wonder why I like, you know, some people like making lists, some people like drawing, and others. And even for little kids, I feel like students are able to, you know, have that metacognitive moment and go, oh, like other people think differently. I like this way, like this is my preference, but maybe I should stretch myself and try it out. So, you know, how do we start letting kids in? I mean, I think groups, things like Odyssey of the Mind, it's like, wow, people really think differently than I do. I didn't even think about it at all that way. I think, you know, any ways that you can show that people think about things differently than you is really cool.
Yeah. And then it's not only how can I try and think about something differently, but how can I bring people who think differently than me onto my team? Because that's not the way that I work, but this is really important. So how can we all work together?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, this has been wonderful. I think we could keep chatting, but I think it's probably time for us to say goodbye. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate all of the insights.
Thank you so much. I had a good time. Always can chat about education forever. I know that feeling on there. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.